There is a room in Jerusalem. It is early morning, the kind of early that still feels like night, when torches are the only light and the city is not yet awake. A man sits on an elevated seat in the center of the room. He is one of the most powerful people in the region. He has soldiers, authority, and a long history of getting whatever he wants. In front of him stands a prisoner. The powerful man asks his questions. He has been waiting for this moment. He's wanted to meet this prisoner for a long time, wanted to see a miracle, wanted to be entertained. He asks again and again. The prisoner says nothing, not one word, not a defense, not an explanation, not even a look of contempt, just silence. Complete, unbroken, deliberate silence. We will come back to this room. We will come back to this prisoner. But to understand why that silence is one of the most powerful moments in all of human history, you need to start somewhere else entirely. You need to start 700 years before that morning with a poet who saw it coming. The prophet Isaiah wrote in the 8th century before Christ. He wrote about a figure he called the suffering servant, a man who would be wounded for the failures of others, crushed for things he did not do. And in the middle of that description, Isaiah wrote something that should have been impossible. He said the servant would be led like a lamb to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers, silent. He would open not his mouth. 700 years before Pilate's courtroom, 700 years before Herod's palace, 700 years before the Garden of Gethsemane and the cross and the 3 hours of darkness, Isaiah already knew. The silence was not a failure to respond. The silence was the plan. This is a video about every time Jesus was silent. Every moment the Son of God chose not to answer, not to defend, not to explain. There are more of these moments than most people realize, and when you line them up, when you look at who he stayed silent for and who he did not, a pattern emerges that will change the way you read the Gospels. Let's start with the moment most people have never thought about as a moment of silence at all. It is early morning in the temple courts, and the religious leaders have just dragged a woman into the middle of a crowd. The setup is deliberate. They have caught her, they say, in the act of adultery. The law of Moses, they remind Jesus loudly, commands that such a woman be stoned. They want him to weigh in. They want him on record. If he says stone her, he loses the crowd that loves him. If he says release her, he contradicts Moses and they have him. It is a perfect trap. Jesus bends down and writes in the dirt. The Greek word used here is katagrapho, to write, to inscribe. John is specific that he wrote. He is not specific about what. And here is what is remarkable. 2,000 years of scholars, church fathers, theologians, and commentators have argued about what Jesus wrote in the dirt that morning. Augustine thought he was writing the sins of the accusers. Others thought he was writing the names of the men who had brought the woman. Others think it was simply a delay, a way of letting the weight of the moment settle before he spoke. We don't know. John doesn't tell us. And that absence, that silence in the text itself, might be exactly the point. Because what happens next is that Jesus stands up and says one sentence. Just one. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And then he bends down and writes in the dirt again. He doesn't watch them leave. He doesn't make eye contact. He doesn't wait for the argument he knows isn't coming. He just writes in the dirt. While one by one the oldest men leave first and then the younger ones until there is nobody left but the woman. He looks up. Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She says, no one, Lord. And he says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. That's it. No sermon, no theological lecture, no extended commentary on the law. He speaks 2 sentences and returns to teaching. The silence on either side of those sentences is doing enormous work. Here's what most people miss. The men who brought the woman were not asking a theological question. They were asking a political one, and Jesus refused to play the game, not by arguing, but by doing something so unexpected, so unhurried, so completely outside the logic of the trap, that the trap collapsed under its own weight. Silence deployed correctly is not passivity, it is power. Now let's go to Bethany, to a tomb, to a moment where Jesus receives terrible news and chooses inexplicably to wait. Lazarus is sick. His sisters Mary and Martha send word to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." And John tells us something extraordinary. He tells us that when Jesus heard this news, he loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And then, he stayed where he was 2 more days. No explanation given, no word sent back to the sisters. Silence. By the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Martha comes out to meet him and says the sentence that every grieving person has felt but rarely been brave enough to say out loud. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." If you had been here, if you had answered sooner, if you had not waited, if you had said something, anything, into the silence. Jesus answers her. He tells her Lazarus will rise. He has a theological exchange with her about resurrection. But when Mary comes out, when the sister who sat at his feet, who anointed his head with perfume, who loved him with an extravagance that made people uncomfortable, when she falls at his feet and says the same words, "Lord, if you had been here," Jesus does not answer. He asks where they have laid him, and they say, "Come and see." And Jesus wept, not after Lazarus was raised, not at the tomb, before. While the stone was still in place and the situation looked impossible and the people around him were saying, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" He could have answered that. He knew the answer. He was about to demonstrate the answer in about 60 seconds, but he didn't answer. He wept. Stay with me. Because this silence, the silence of a God who weeps before he acts, tells you something about what Jesus thought was important. He was not in a hurry to explain himself. He was not rushing past the grief to get to the miracle. He was willing to sit in the sadness of it, with them. The silence was not distance. The silence was presence. Let's talk about the night everything fell apart. Gethsemane, the garden. Jesus has just finished what we call the high priestly prayer, the longest recorded prayer in the Gospels. And now, he is alone. He has told his disciples to watch and pray. They are asleep within the hour. He goes further into the garden, falls on his face, and says, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." And heaven is silent. No voice comes from the clouds the way it did at his baptism. No angel appears with a word of encouragement. Well, Luke says an angel came to strengthen him, but not to answer the prayer. Not to say yes, not to say no, just to strengthen him for what is coming. He prays the same prayer 3 times. 3 times he asks. 3 times the silence holds. This is the part that should stop you cold if you have ever prayed something urgent and heard nothing back. The Son of God, in the worst night of his life, asked the same thing 3 times, and the answer was not a word. It was an angel who gave him strength to keep going. The silence of Gethsemane is not the silence of an absent God. It is the silence of a God who said, through the very absence of a different answer, "I am with you in this." And we are going through it. Here's the part nobody tells you about Pilate. Pontius Pilate was not a gentle man. He was a Roman prefect with a documented history of provocation. Josephus, the Jewish historian, records at least 4 separate incidents where Pilate deliberately antagonized the Jewish population of Judea, including hanging Roman shields bearing the emperor's image inside Jerusalem itself and raiding the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. He was not someone who was easily unsettled. And yet Matthew tells us something remarkable. When Jesus stood before Pilate and the chief priests made their accusations, Jesus answered nothing. And Pilate asked him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And Jesus answered him not one word. The Greek here is siopao, to be silent, to hold one's peace. Matthew says Pilate marveled greatly. A Roman governor, a man who had interrogated criminals, rebels, and revolutionaries, a man who had sent people to their deaths without a second thought. He marveled. He was undone by silence. Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing around AD 116, confirms the execution of Christus under Pilate in his annals. He doesn't record the silence, but Pilate's response to it, his hand-washing, his wife's dream, his repeated attempts to release Jesus, suggests a man who was deeply unsettled by something he could not name. Because here is what Pilate understood at some level, even if he could not articulate it. Innocent men defend themselves. Guilty men bargain. Men who know they are about to die beg or rage or collapse. This man did none of those things. This man stood in absolute stillness. And Pilate, who had all the power in that room by every human measure, felt it slipping. Now we come back to the room we started in. Early morning. Torches, a powerful man on a seat, and a prisoner who will not speak. This is not Pilate's courtroom, this is Herod's. Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, the man who had John the Baptist beheaded at a dinner party because a girl danced well and he'd made a foolish promise. Luke tells us that when Pilate heard Jesus was a Galilean, he sent him to Herod, because Herod had jurisdiction over Galilee and happened to be in Jerusalem for Passover. And Luke tells us that Herod was very glad. He had wanted to see Jesus for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see a miracle performed. He questioned Jesus at some length. Jesus answered him nothing, and here is what you need to understand. This is the only person in the entire gospel narrative that Jesus flatly refused to acknowledge. Not the Pharisees. He debated them constantly. Not Pilate. He gave Pilate at least 3 responses. Not the high priest. He answered the high priest directly. Herod, the man who killed John the Baptist, the man who Jesus had called that fox, the man who wanted a miracle the way you want a parlor trick, not because he believed, not because he was seeking, but because he was bored and powerful and used to getting what he wanted. Jesus looked at Herod and gave him nothing. Not an argument, not a rebuke, not even a look of contempt. Just silence, total, absolute, unbroken silence. And in that silence was a verdict, not a legal one, something deeper. This is what it looks like when the Son of God decides a conversation is over. Not with anger, not with words, with nothing. And then the cross. It is the 6th hour when the darkness comes, noon. The sun should be at its highest. Instead, for 3 hours, darkness covers the land. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record it. No explanation is given, no voice from heaven interprets it. Just darkness and silence, and a man dying on a Roman instrument of execution. At the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cries out. It is the only moment in the Gospels where he quotes a psalm mid-prayer, and the quote is a question. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is Psalm 22. David wrote it 1,000 years before the cross. And Jesus, in the worst moment of human history, in the silence of 3 hours of unexplained darkness, quotes the one psalm that begins with abandonment and ends with rescue. He is not simply expressing despair. He is praying a psalm that his listeners, any Jewish person standing at the foot of that cross, would know ends in vindication. But in the moment it sounds like a man who prayed and heard nothing back. And then he dies. And there is silence again. 3 days of it, here is the last silence, and it is the strangest one. Two disciples are walking from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus. It is the third day after the crucifixion. They are destroyed. They are talking to each other, trying to make sense of something that has made no sense when a stranger falls into step beside them. The stranger asks what they are talking about. They stop walking. They look at him with faces that Luke says were sad. And one of them, a man named Cleopas, says, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days?" The stranger says, "What things?" And they tell him everything. How they had hoped Jesus was the one to redeem Israel. How the chief priests and rulers delivered him to be condemned to death. How some women from their group had gone to the tomb that morning and found it empty. How some of their number had gone and found it just as the women said. They walk 7 miles together. The stranger opens the scriptures to them, beginning with Moses, going through all the prophets, explaining everything that was written about the Messiah. Luke says their hearts burned within them as he talked. They feel something they cannot name. They reach Emmaus. The stranger acts as if he is going further. They beg him to stay. He comes in. He sits at the table. He takes bread, and he blesses it and breaks it and gives it to them. And their eyes are opened, and they recognize him. And he vanishes 7 miles. The whole length of that walk, Jesus was silent about who he was. Not deceptive. He answered their questions. He opened the scriptures. He gave them everything they needed. But he did not say, "It is I." He waited. He waited until the bread was broken, until the gesture they had seen 100 times before was repeated in a room in Emmaus at the end of a terrible week. He chose the moment of revelation, as he always did. The silence was not confusion. The silence was patience. The silence was love, taking its time. So here are the 3 things to take from every moment of silence we've looked at today. The first is this: Jesus was never silent because he lacked an answer. He was silent because he understood something about power that we rarely grasp. That the person who controls whether a conversation happens at all holds more authority than the person who controls what is said. When Jesus was silent before Pilate, before Herod, before the accusers in the temple court, he was not powerless. He was operating from a position so far above the logic of the room that entering the argument would have diminished him. Silence, in those moments, was sovereignty. The second thing is this: some of the silences were not about power at all. They were about grief. The silence at Lazarus's tomb, the silence of Gethsemane, the silence of 3 hours of darkness on the cross. These were not silences of authority. They were silences of presence. Jesus wept before he raised Lazarus. He prayed 3 times before he surrendered. He cried out from the cross in the language of a psalm that ends in rescue. He did not skip the suffering to get to the meaning. He went through it. And if you have ever sat in a silence that felt like God had nothing to say to you, this is worth knowing. The silence of Gethsemane was not absence. It was a God who was already inside the darkness with his Son, working something that could not be explained in words. The third thing, and this is the one that should stay with you, is that Jesus reserved his most absolute silence for one person. Not his enemies, not Rome, not even the religious leaders who had plotted for months to kill him. He reserved it for a man who wanted entertainment, who wanted a miracle as a performance, who had no interest in truth, no hunger for God, no question he actually wanted answered. Herod got nothing, because Jesus will not perform for the curious. He will debate the hostile, weep with the grieving, walk 7 miles with the devastated. But for the man who wants a show, silence. And maybe the question worth sitting with today is not whether God has been silent in your life. Maybe the question is, which kind of silence has it been? The silence before Lazarus's tomb, where he was weeping with you before the stone was rolled away? The silence of Gethsemane, where the answer was not a word, but a presence? Or the silence of Emmaus, where he was walking beside you the whole time, waiting for the moment your eyes would open? He has not left the room. He never does. If this video made you see the Gospels differently, consider subscribing. There are more of these coming, more patterns in Scripture that most people walk past without noticing. And if you want to go deeper on the silence of the cross and what Psalm 22 is actually saying, that video is right here. We will see you in the next one.